Hello, everyone. Sientir here, and welcome to my Patron podcast for October 2021. My patrons selected what are my thoughts on No Time to Die, the most recent James Bond film, and the Daniel Craig era of Bond as the topic for this month. As a reminder, you can always sign up at patreon.com/Sientir in order to be able to suggest and vote on topics. And let's go ahead and jump into it. So, of course, spoilers incoming for probably not only No Time to Die, which came out earlier this month, but also for Daniel Craig's whole era, which has been a very long one. Started with Casino Royale back in, what was it, '06, I think I was seeing mentioned earlier. And then Quantum of Solace, Skyfall, Spectre, and now No Time to Die. So not the most prolific in terms of actual films, but certainly a long run. So just a little bit of context, I have been a fan of James Bond films for quite some time, but I got into the franchise through GoldenEye for the Nintendo 64, as I'm sure many other people did. So first, we need to describe and define what do I look for in James Bond? Like what sort of character do I see James Bond as being? Because this is very important for what any of my thoughts are about Daniel Craig as James Bond and his entire era. Everybody has a different idea of who James Bond is. And for me, James Bond is sort of a superhero. Luck's always on his side, basically, and he's very much kind of fulfilling sort of super spy, like spy superhero is kind of where I see him at. To me, the gadgets are very important, and sort of a more of a lighthearted tone. My favorite James Bond film, for reference, is GoldenEye, and I'm particularly fond of Pierce Brosnan. He's my favorite actor who's portrayed Bond to this point, although I have seen most of the James Bond films except for like a weird oddball like the '67 Casino Royale, which I semi-recently learned exists at all. So that's just a little bit of context for where I'm at in terms of a person who's doing any sort of evaluation. This is a very subjective thing, of course, my thoughts on. In terms of No Time to Die, I personally really quite enjoyed it. I felt it was a really good way to end Daniel Craig's era. There were some fun gadgets, and I felt that the character, like the writing about the characters and the character drama was very strong. And I quite enjoyed that. I also really liked the callbacks to On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Not my favorite Bond film by any means, but, a reference can be really strong regardless. And all of the references to We Have All the Time in the World from that, and everything with Tracy from that is a very strong thing. And it landed very, very strongly with me. I'm not somebody who cries easily at all, and it got me a little teary-eyed by the end. I think it was a bold choice to have. This is, of course, the big spoilers. Have James Bond die at the end, but a really interesting sort of way of encapsulating Daniel Craig's era. Daniel Craig very much so was trying to portray a Bond from beginning to end, and that's what his era did. And I think that was a really interesting and bold choice. I know even starting with GoldenEye, back at that point, the people over there at, was it Eon Productions? Anyway, the Broccoli's and all of the staff making James Bond had a really hard time trying to figure out who is James Bond, how does he fit into the world post-Cold War, because he's very much so a product of the Cold War. And that's something that they talked about in the Brosnan era, came up then as they're trying to figure it out. And to be clear, I think that era went a little bit overboard in gadgets, so I understand why they kind of went back with Casino Royale with Daniel Craig. But it was something that they had asked themselves for Craig's era as well, as who is James Bond today? Because cinema has changed. A lot of social mores have changed. A lot of what people are looking for in cinema has changed. There's just been a lot of things that have kind of adjusted over the time. So to me, like, there needs to be some amount of the sort of Bond girl angle there, just because it's been so long running, but it doesn't have to be to the same degree of promiscuity that was going on, particularly in like the Roger Moore era. So, No Time to Die, I liked the character writing. I liked the development with the characters. I thought stuff with Dr. Swan was really interesting. There are a lot of interesting implications with things. And I liked the way that they wrapped up his era. Speaking of, let's go back over his era. Now, one of the things that's really significant is there's a distinction between. I'm looking at my looky place, which is up there. Um, there's a distinction between a movie that I enjoy as a film and a movie that I enjoy as a thing in the franchise. I'll clarify here. I enjoyed Casino Royale as a movie. I did not like it at all as a Bond film. So there's a couple of reasons for this. The whole tone, the way that it was shot, the focus of it, the tone. I'm going to say tone again, but like that's a very significant part of it. And the lack of gadgets were all things that contributed to not feeling like a Bond film to me. It did not feel like superhero spy, which is again what James Bond is to me. And Craig's era kind of shifts and turns on this as it goes. I know when Casino Royale came out, and particularly Quantum of Solace kind of falls into this as well, it felt very much so like James Bourne, not James Bond. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad film by any means. It just, to me, it is not what I want from a James Bond film. So it's this weird sort of paradox where, on the one hand, it can be a film that I think is a really good and enjoyable film, and on the other hand, it does not feel like a James Bond film and is very bad at being a Bond film. And so for a lot of Craig's era, it's been kind of in and out with this. They've really kind of flirted with the idea of like, is he really 007 and a lot of stuff that way. Frankly, the lack of naked women silhouettes in some of the opening credit sequences has kind of landed a bit weird to me, just because it's been such a mainstay of the series. I don't dislike them going away from as much as I did with just Casino Royale. And it's been a little bit since I've watched the rest of his era to remember how much they may have brought some of that stuff back. But with the playing cards flying around and everything, it's not to say it's a bad sequence. It's just it's not quite what I was expecting. It's like when you go to take a drink of what you think is milk, and it's actually a cup of orange juice. It's like, you might love orange juice. I mean, I personally really like orange juice, but it's also not at all the same flavor as milk. And so if my brain's been primed for one and I get the other, it's like, oh, that's not the flavor I'm enjoying. And that's, for me, a lot of what happened with some of the films like Casino Royale in particular. I do think it's been a really interesting way to approach James Bond, though. And I think the sort of structure that they've used, I should bring my hands up if I'm going to gesture with them, the sort of structure that they've used of having a beginning to James Bond where, like in Casino Royale, like it starts with him becoming 007 and then ending with his death, I think is a really interesting sort of like arc and a really interesting way of doing that and presenting a James Bond. But it also kind of drops away from. Timeless is not quite the right word, because the James Bond films are always very much so products of their era. But you know what I mean? Where like James Bond, he's kind of an immortal or eternal character or figure where he just kind of is and doesn't really have that beginning or an end. And choosing to put one on him, it's a very interesting change, and not one that I think is bad. It's not one that I object to personally. And I wouldn't necessarily mind seeing them follow that same sort of structure for future James Bonds. In some regards, it takes it from an almost timeless character, if that makes any sense, for something that gets so dated in some of them, that are very much the products of the era, and brings it into almost more of a mythic area. This is actually kind of an interesting concept. Suddenly my brain is like Legend of Zelda series. For those who are not familiar with the video game franchise Legend of Zelda, they being Nintendo, the creators of it, have kind of made a timeline for them. But to me, they work well as mythology, where mythology, if you look at it, there's a bunch of different sources, a bunch of different retellings, and a bunch of different ideas of what these stories are. And so you can have contradictory elements, you can have contrasting elements, you can have details that change, but other things that kind of stay the same. There's always a Q, there's always an M. Well, there's not always a Q because Dr. No didn't have a Q, but there's usually a Q, there's an M, there's James Bond 007, the spy, Moneypenny, the secretary to M. Like you have these constant elements, um, but the rest of it can kind of like shift and be a little bit more malleable. Just like in The Legend of Zelda, there's always Link and Zelda, and there's Ganon/Ganondorf, um, and the Triforce is usually significant, but the Master Sword is a common recurring element. Bombs are common recurring gadget for Link, as it were. So you have some of these things that like each one can just be a different telling of the same myth, but it's got a very mythic structure to it. And I think James Bond can encapsulate that regardless of whether or not it's the more timeless variety that we've had previously or the discrete, each actor has an era, a beginning and an end sort of model that we had with Daniel Craig. I do think overall a lot of Daniel Craig's films have been a little bit darker than what I want. I want Bond to feel a little bit more lighthearted, a little bit more of that superhero. They definitely had some films that more fell into that category than others, though. So I don't know. I don't have any sort of like distinct conclusion. Just that I hope that the next James Bond, whoever they may be, is a bit more lighthearted, a little bit less serious. Walks away from some of the influences of the Dark Knight series, perhaps that may have been on it, or the Batman. Is it Christopher Nolan? I think it's Christopher Nolan. Batman series. And the Jason Bourne stuff and whatnot, and tries to capture its roots again, and of more of a lighthearted romp, spy thriller romp with the wit and it's not to say that Daniel Craig didn't have those things. It's just that the overall tone of a lot of his films were a lot darker, I thought, and I'd like something a bit lighter. So. Those have been my general thoughts on Daniel Craig's era as James Bond. I'd be happy to hear what you're looking for in James Bond and who James Bond is to you in the comments below. And until next time, everyone, thank you very much for watching or listening. You can, of course, support me on my Patreon at patreon.com/Sientir and help select future topics. Until next time, everyone, take care and goodbye.